Henry Caldwell, 76, a veteran facing terminal pancreatic cancer, refused to surrender. Instead, his daily ritual involved an old, out-of-tune piano at Oakshade Meadows. What began as a private act of defiance, a personal battle against his own fading life, soon sparked an unexpected symphony of memory, unlocking forgotten worlds for others. Henry Caldwell, at 76, viewed his diagnosis not as a sentence but as a final, non-negotiable set of orders. Pancreatic cancer. The enemy was inside the wire, and this was a battle he knew he wouldn't win. A veteran of the Mekong Delta, he was no stranger to ultimatums delivered by fate, but this one was different. It was quiet, insidious, and it had set a silent, metronomic tick to the final measures of his life's composition. Yet, he refused to surrender to the sterile stillness of a sickbed. Surrender wasn't in his nature, so he adhered to a ritual as unshakable as the tides. Every afternoon at 3, he would push himself up from his armchair, the joints in his knees groaning in protest, and make the slow pilgrimage to the common room of Oakshade Meadows' care home. The journey took him down a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and steamed broccoli, past residents slumped in wheelchairs, their gazes fixed on some distant, inner horizon. The air was thick with the low hum of daytime television and the soft, rhythmic sighs of slumber. Then he would arrive at his post, the worn, out-of-tune upright piano tucked into a corner beneath a water-stained landscape painting. Its mahogany veneer was scarred with the history of the place. A faint coffee ring, a constellation of tiny scratches, one key, the F above middle C, permanently yellowed like an old smoker's tooth. For an hour each day, Henry would sit on the wobbly bench, his gnarled fingers, stiffened by arthritis, finding their familiar places on the keys. This wasn't a performance for applause. It was a private rite of passage, a slow, melodic act of defiance. He rarely played the classics. What flowed from his hands were fragments, improvisational sketches drawn from the long, rambling manuscript of his own existence. He'd play the ghost of a tune he'd heard on a crackling Saigon radio, a sound that briefly cut through the humidity and fear. He'd trace the simple, tender waltz he'd composed for his late wife, Eleanor, on their 30th anniversary. He played for an audience adrift in the fog of time, for the woman who stared blankly at the wall, and the man whose hands shook with a tremor that never ceased. He was building a fleeting sanctuary of sound, a refuge for himself, and for these souls forgotten by the relentless march of their own memories. In the dusty, sunlit air of Oakshade Meadows, he played for ghosts, both theirs and his own, hoping the music might offer a single, clear moment in the encroaching twilight. Zoe Finch, at 22, was armed with textbooks, theories, and a boundless, yet-to-be-tested optimism. As a music therapy intern at Oakshade Meadows, she saw the world through the lens of clinical application and measurable outcomes. Her first 2 weeks had been a humbling exercise in futility. She tried everything in her academic arsenal, rhythm-based engagement with a man whose Parkinson's tremor only seemed to grow more agitated by the metronome's rigid beat, calming ocean soundscapes that were promptly drowned out by a resident turning up the volume on a blaring game show. Even a cheerful sing-along of wartime classics that earned her nothing but vacant stares. Her carefully curated playlists, designed for maximum therapeutic effect, fell flat in the heavy, listless air of the common room. Initially, Henry's daily concert was, to her, a charming but unstructured piece of the facility's ambient noise, a quaint, slightly melancholic backdrop to the real work she was failing to do. It was unprofessional, she thought at first. The tempo was uneven, he'd occasionally hit a wrong note, and the melodies were unfamiliar, belonging to no established therapeutic canon. Her perception shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, a particularly listless one where the air hung heavy and still. Defeated, she had retreated to a corner with her clipboard, trying to re-strategize, when Henry's music began to filter through her frustration. He was playing a slow, hesitant waltz, a melody that seemed to carry the weight of a long-ago rain, full of pauses as if searching for the next phrase. Her eyes, almost by habit, scanned the room and landed on Mrs. Elara Vance. Mrs. Vance was the embodiment of the disease's cruel victory, a woman encased in the impenetrable fortress of late-stage Alzheimer's. For 2 years she had been a silent statue, her body present but her mind seemingly lost to some unreachable shore. But now, as Henry's waltz filled the room, a flicker of life disturbed the stillness. First, a twitch of her eyelid. Then, her head, usually slumped to her chest, lifted by a fraction of an inch. A single tear escaped and traced a slow, glistening path down her deeply wrinkled cheek. Zoe sat bolt upright, her pen frozen above the page. Mrs. Vance's lips, usually slack, trembled and parted. And from them a sound, not a word but a breath given shape, rusty from disuse yet achingly clear, emerged. Leo. The name hung in the air, a ghost summoned by a melody. It was a sound of such profound, heart-wrenching intimacy that it felt like an intrusion to have heard it. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. Her clipboard, with its neat columns and clinical jargon, suddenly felt like a useless artifact from another world. She looked from Mrs. Vance's glistening eyes back to Henry, whose own gaze was fixed on the keys, his face a mask of concentration, seemingly unaware of the small, seismic event he had just caused. In that moment, Zoe's entire education was upended. This wasn't random background music. This wasn't a hobby. It was a key. With a jolt of awe that eclipsed any academic excitement, she realized she was witnessing a form of therapy so precise, so personal, it could never be taught in a classroom. Henry wasn't just playing notes. He was a cartographer of forgotten worlds, and she had just watched him draw a map back to a place called Leo. Zoe's clipboard became her sacred text. The clinical detachment of the intern was replaced by the fervent focus of an anthropologist who had stumbled upon a lost language. For the next week she became Henry's shadow, a silent, respectful observer perched in her usual corner. Her notebook, once filled with sterile theory, now bloomed with life. She documented it all with a researcher's precision. Thursday, 3:17 p.m. Jaunty, fragmented march in C major. Subject, Mr. Gable, Parkinson's. Result, rhythmic tapping of right foot, hand tremors visibly reduced for approximately 4 minutes. Or Friday, 3:42 p.m. Simple, rocking lullaby, minor key. Subject, Anya Petrova, generalized anxiety. Result, pacing ceased. Subject sat and closed her eyes. The evidence was undeniable, a pattern of cause and effect as clear as any scientific paper she'd ever read. Armed with a week's worth of these small, documented miracles, she gathered her courage. She waited until Henry had finished playing one afternoon, as he sat for a moment, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, the effort of the hour settling upon him. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice softer than she intended. He looked up, his eyes weary but sharp. "Miss Finch." "Your music," she said, stepping closer, her notebook clutched like a shield. "It's not just music. It's targeted. It's a key. What you did for Mrs. Vance, for Mr. Gable, it's the most profound music therapy I've ever witnessed." A flicker of something, pride, annoyance, crossed his face before being extinguished. "It's just a few old tunes." "No, it's more," she pressed, her excitement overriding her caution. "That's why I wanted to ask you. I want to help you record them. We could create a collection, a memory melody set. We could write down the context for each piece. It could help so many people, people you'll never even meet." The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a sudden, impenetrable cold. He slowly lowered the piano's lid, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. "No," he said. The word was flat, final. Zoe was stunned. "But why? You saw what it does." He finally turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw the hardened gaze of the soldier beneath the gentle pianist. "You don't understand, miss. This is a private thing. It's for them." He gestured vaguely to the empty chairs. "And for me. You want to put it in a machine, turn it into a specimen to be put under a microscope. I'm an old man playing a piano to pass the time. That's all. I won't have my last days turned into a project. He stood up, the conversation declared over, a wall of resolute privacy erected where, moments before, a bridge had seemed possible. Zoe didn't push. A lesser person might have, armed with such righteous conviction, but she understood the nature of the wall Henry had built. It wasn't made of simple stubbornness. It was fortified with a lifetime of guarded privacy and the hard-won dignity of a man facing his own end. So she changed her tactics. She didn't mention the recording again. She simply continued to watch, her presence becoming a quiet, constant fixture in the corner of the room. Her notebook remained open on her lap, but it was no longer a tool for persuasion. It was a testament. A week passed in this silent accord. Then, one afternoon, after his final note had faded, Zoe approached him not with a request but with a gift. She wordlessly handed him her notebook, open to the first page of her observations. He looked at it, then at her, his expression wary. Reluctantly, he took it. That evening, in the solitude of his own room, Henry read it. He saw his few old tunes broken down and analyzed with a scientist's precision. He saw his casual, almost unconscious musical meanderings documented as specific, effective interventions. Monday, a brisk, hopeful melody in G major. Result: Mr. Henderson, post-stroke depression, smiled for the first time in a month. The notes were stripped of sentiment, clinical and objective, yet they told the most emotional story of his life. A lifetime spent deflecting praise, of burying emotion under layers of duty and stoicism, had left him unprepared for this. To see the private, ephemeral act of his playing laid bare as something of tangible value was profoundly unsettling. It was also undeniable. The true turning point, however, came the following afternoon. The air was thick with the coming of a storm, and a heavy, gray light filled the common room. Henry felt the weariness deep in his bones, a fatigue that the music could no longer fully hold at bay. He almost didn't play, but habit, that most stubborn of sergeants, marched him to the piano bench. His fingers, moving on their own, found the familiar, hesitant waltz, Ilara's waltz. He played it with his eyes closed, letting the melody guide him. And then through the notes, a voice cut through the room's stillness. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, imbued with a gentle, dreamlike certainty. "Leo," Mrs. Vance said, her eyes wide open and fixed on the middle distance, a soft smile gracing her lips. "It's our dance." The music stopped. Henry's hands froze over the keys. Every head in the room turned. But Henry wasn't looking at Mrs. Vance. He was staring at his own reflection in the polished, dark wood of the piano's fallboard. He saw the faint tremor in his own chin. He saw the glint of moisture in his eyes, a sight so foreign he barely recognized the man looking back. It wasn't the reflection of the stoic veteran or the tired old man. It was the face of a man witnessing a resurrection. He had spent his life in service, to his country, to his family. He thought that part of his life was over. But here, in this room, he had been fighting one last, quiet battle without even knowing it. A battle not against an enemy, but for a memory. For a woman's right to remember the name of her love and the feel of a dance. And in that moment, he knew he had won. He took a slow, ragged breath. He didn't turn around immediately. He just stared at his own shaken reflection for a long moment. Then, his voice low and gravelly, he spoke to the quiet young woman he knew was standing behind him. "Kid," he said, the word heavy with surrender and resolve, "tell me, what do we need to do?" The project began not with a flourish, but with the quiet hum of a small, second-hand digital recorder Zoe had bought with money saved from her part-time barista job. Their studio was the Oakshade Meadows common room, transformed by the hushed intimacy of twilight. After the dinner trays were cleared and most residents had retired to their rooms, the space became theirs. The scent of disinfectant gave way to the faint, dusty smell of old wood and sheet music. This was a race against a clock that ticked with Henry's own fading pulse. Some evenings the sessions were painfully short. The cancer, a relentless thief, was stealing his energy. He would manage 10, maybe 15 minutes of playing before a wave of fatigue would wash over him, leaving him pale and breathless. His hands would begin to shake, not with age but with sheer exhaustion. On those nights, Zoe would simply say, "That's a good place to stop, Henry," and they would sit in silence, listening to the playback, the simple act of shared listening becoming its own form of therapy. But on other nights, a different kind of energy would take hold, spurred by Zoe's gentle, probing questions. "What were you thinking of when you wrote that one, Henry?" The music became a conduit for memory. The recording sessions evolved into something more profound than mere documentation. They became a final confession, a last testament. As he played, the stories would spill out, unearthed from the compacted soil of his memory. The jaunty march that calmed Mr. Gable's tremors was born from the cadence of his platoon, marching through a Vietnamese village. A moment of youthful bravado before the world changed forever. He named it Soldier's Morning. The lullaby that soothed Anya Petrova was a half-remembered tune his own mother used to hum as she worked at her sewing machine, the sound of safety in a world that felt vast and frightening to a small boy. He called it Eleanor's Porch Song, after his wife, who had loved the story. Zoe, sitting on a low stool with the recorder balanced on her knees, was no longer just an intern. She was an archivist, a confidant, the keeper of his flame. She learned about his terror in the jungle, the crushing grief of losing his wife to a sudden illness, the quiet pride he felt watching his daughter graduate from college. The melodies were the chapter headings, the stories were the text. Each note was imbued with a life lived, with joy and sorrow, with love and regret. One evening, as he struggled to replicate the precise, delicate phrasing of Alara's waltz, he faltered, his fingers stumbling on a chord. "It's no good," he rasped, frustrated. I can't feel it tonight." Zoe didn't offer empty encouragement. Instead, she asked softly, "What did the dance hall look like, Henry? The one where you met Leo's wife?" He closed his eyes. "It wasn't a hall," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "It was a barn after the war, a welcome home party. There were fairy lights strung from the rafters, sawdust on the floor." He took a breath, and when his fingers returned to the keys, the music was there. It was perfect. The sessions were no longer about capturing a performance. They were about excavating a soul. And in the quiet common room of Oakshade Meadows, a dying man and a young woman on the cusp of her career were collaborating on a masterpiece, a legacy forged in sound and memory. They finished in the last week of September, as the leaves outside the common room window began their slow surrender to gold and crimson. The final collection, which they titled the Oakshade Sonatas, comprised 27 distinct melodic pieces. It was a humble digital file, a mere handful of megabytes, yet it contained the weight of a lifetime. Zoe meticulously cataloged each track, pairing it with her observational notes and a short, anonymized story from Henry about its origin. It was a complete, holistic therapeutic tool, born not in a lab but in the crucible of authentic human connection. With Henry's blessing, Zoe sent the files to her university professor, Dr. Anya Sharma, a leading figure in palliative care music therapy. She attached a simple email, explaining the project's unconventional genesis and its profound effects within the walls of Oakshade Meadows. She didn't expect much, perhaps a note of academic encouragement. The reply came 3 days later, not as an email, but as an urgent request for a video call. Zoe set up her laptop on the rolling table beside Henry's bed. He was weaker now, the piano sessions having taken their final toll. He was mostly confined to his room, the world shrinking to the dimensions of his mattress. When the video connected, Dr. Sharma's face appeared, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was another woman, her face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. She introduced herself as a therapist from a hospice facility in Portland, Oregon, nearly 3,000 miles away. "Mr. Caldwell," the Portland therapist began, her voice thick with emotion. I used your music this morning. Soldier's Morning." She paused, composing herself. "I have a patient, another Vietnam veteran. He hasn't spoken to his family in weeks. He's been angry, shut down. We were losing him, but I played your piece and he started to tap his foot. Then he looked at his son and he started to talk. He told him a story about his first day in basic training. They talked for an hour. She wiped a tear from her eye. He said goodbye to them, Mr. Caldwell. You gave them that. Zoe turned to look at Henry. He was lying back against the pillows, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were open and fixed on the screen. A slow, deep peace seemed to settle over his features, smoothing the lines of pain and weariness. It was the look of a soldier whose long duty was finally, truly done. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. His life was a fading note, yes, but its echo had just begun to resonate in rooms he would never see, for people he would never know. He had found a way to make his ending a beginning. Coda. Henry Caldwell passed away 2 days later, in the quiet of the early morning, as peacefully as the final note of a lullaby fading into silence. Months later, Zoe Finch stood at a podium in a brightly lit conference hall in Chicago. She was no longer an intern, but a licensed music therapist, her name badge glinting under the lights. In front of her sat hundreds of her peers, a sea of faces from across the country. Her presentation for the National Music Therapy Symposium had no complex charts, no dense academic jargon. She simply stood, and in the reverent quiet of the auditorium, she told them a story about a stubborn old soldier and his out-of-tune piano. Then she played the first track of the Oakshade Sonatas. As the simple, hesitant notes of Elara's waltz filled the vast hall, a profound stillness descended. It was the sound of a life, distilled to its purest essence, a testament to the fact that even at the very end, a single human soul could become an inexhaustible source of light, its warmth reaching out to heal others long after its own flame had been extinguished.